Alrighty, welcome back to another top 50. So, BK and myself, we put together this list with the help of the Peanut Gallery. Troll, Mac, Martel, and Adhem chimed in. But what we're going to do is go over our top 50 pick one, pack ones. It's obviously very important that it's exactly that, and discuss some of the cards that didn't quite make the list. Let's start with the first kind of interesting decision: Time Walk, Lotus, Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, plus Mox as an Ancestral. We have this in this order because pick one, pack one. If you first pick a Time Walk, you can just draft, the Tamiyo Planeswalker, Jace, Snapcaster Mage, Eternal Witness, Regrowth when it's in the cube. And the new Tamiyo actually also can get back Time Walk. There's just a lot of ways to abuse it, and just Planeswalkers in general, big mana decks or decks that have a lot of creatures in it, like anything that gets you value from the untap step and the attack step. So I still like Time Walk, pick one, pack one. I don't really think you're going to go wrong with any of these 10 cards. And I don't think you should take like a Mox, for example, over Time Walk, Soul Ring, or Lotus. Mana Crypt is a little more debatable, but I'm liking Time Walk first pick.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. The fact that there's so many tutors and ways to recur it that aren't high picks for other people mean that you get to do pretty broken stuff with Time Walk pretty consistently when you open a pack one, pick one, more so than really any other card in our opinion.
Lotus and Soul Ring are also kind of hotly debated. The fact that Lotus fixes your colors, I think, is a pretty big tiebreaker. And it just, you exchange basically long-term mana off Soul Ring for just one burst. If you open Lotus, the things you're looking for are cards like Minsk and Boo. This might be the best card to Lotus out on turn one. Something like Fable, obviously Lurrus, that's a slightly different thing. But good 4 and 5 mana plays are where Lotus tends to shine.
Yeah, I pretty frequently when I see other people drafting, when they get a Lotus, I don't see them maybe appropriately take cards higher that they should, just because I just want to make sure whenever I draft Black Lotus that I can have a good density of those 3 and 4 drops, which are super impactful to get into. And then you can mulligan accordingly. You can have ways to tutor your Lotus to get it going. There's a lot of cool routes that Lotus takes you down.
Also, it does fit into the proactive strategy. It's much better to crack Lotus to cast 2/2 drops on turn one than it is to try to crack it to cast a counterspell. So Lotus definitely pushes that.
And then the Soul Ring Mana Crypt thing of it all. I think Mana Crypt is probably maybe even a little bit more powerful than Soul Ring. One of the great things about Soul Ring, though, is that you're not taking the damage every turn, and so you can draft a little bit of a greater variety of decks. Soul Ring will be really strong in your slower blue-based control decks than Mana Crypt will be, where managing the life loss can be a real issue. So I like starting off with Soul Ring more than Mana Crypt. If you're ever fortunate to have that decision, well, good for you.
Also, if you draft Mana Crypt, I'm just looking to draft something like Red White, or that's one of the decks that best uses the Mana Crypt and gets the game over with quickly. And if you have something like Gut, could even sack the Mana Crypt. So
yeah, anything Naya related is where you want to be if you get Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, and honestly, to a lesser degree, but still true, any of the Moxen. I think the Naya colors just have the best. Black and blue, just it's not as high frequency of game turning 3 and 4 mana plays that you can cheat into play early.
Yeah. The Moxes, again, it doesn't really matter which order you take them in. We have them ranked Pearl, Ruby, Jet, Sapphire, Emerald, and I'm convinced Emerald is the worst because Mox Emerald is just not as necessary in a color that has Birds of Paradise. You're not getting as much value. Mox Pearl and Ruby, I really like those because, again, they have just such good assertive threats, and that's what uses Moxen the best. But any of the Moxen are great, and you take them no matter which color you are, so it doesn't matter too much. I think the first controversial thing we'll have here is Ancestral Recall after all the busted mana, but I think both of us really have come to the conclusion that you lose more games based on not having a fast enough start or fast mana. You lose to your opponent having that or you not having that. And Ancestral Recall, it gets better the better your deck is and the cheaper your deck is and all that. And obviously it's a great card. I take it, more than 9 times out of 10 when I see it. But I do think if your goal is to win, you should first pick a Mox over Ancestral because it just is going to make the average deck better to have a Mox than to have an Ancestral.
Yeah, as the power level of Cube has continued to go up and as the best cards have gotten cheaper, just so many good 2, 3, and 4 mana cards that you can get into play ahead of your opponent. Look at this list. It's cards like Oko and Psychic Frog and Fable the Mirror Breaker, Broadside Bombardiers. All of these cards, it really matters that you're getting them down a turn before your opponent could otherwise have up a counter spell or have more of a board to contend with them.
So that's the power plus, Soul Ring Mana Crypt. Here's a big one. I like Flash over every non-power card in the cube right now. I just feel like pick one, pack one. If you take Flash, that's just a really easy way to end up with a deck that can do consistently busted things. You're looking for, Woodfall Primus, World Spineworm, Vaultborn Tyrant, Atroxa, and you're looking for Spellseeker, Mystical Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, that sort of thing. And you can just end up with a deck that pretty reliably is able to cast Flash on turns 2 or 3, and you'll win the game when you do that a lot of the time. I mean, and Torsten's another one. Like, there's just so many good things to Flash in.
Yeah, when we're looking at the absolute best cards in the cube, the cards that can get to their high powers, their highest ceiling, because they're taking up other last picks, is pretty attractive. And so a card like Flash, I think I think it would be clear to people if you look through this list that it has the higher ceiling, because it's the big three is of Torsten, World Spineworm, and Woodfall Primus. Torsten is the best if you're under wide duress attacks and you need more cards at the same time. World Spineworm is the best at getting the game over with, and Woodfall Primus is the best at just stopping your opponent from doing anything because you get to blow up 2 lands early on in games. Doing any of those things is so good that it's better than needing the extra setup of having a bunch of mana for 4th Aerlingus, of needing to have material and stuff to kill with Broadside Bombardiers.
Yeah, well, and I stand by this rating of Flash. That said, you're not really going to go wrong if you take Broadside Bombardiers, 4th Aerlingus, Bowmaster. These are all, I think, in a similar tier of extremely strong cards that have a really big impact on the game and are not that expensive. I mean, 4th has the highest cost ceiling because it's X, but I've cast a lot of 4th Aerlinguses for 2 or 3 and had really good effect. You can even cast it for 1. I had an opponent do it against me earlier today. Just, make a 2/2 and get the Monarch. 4th scales really well over the course of the game as well. How often when you have 4th Aerlingus in your deck, do you get to the point in the game where if I draw 4th, you just win? It's just like starting on turn 6, anytime you draw 4th, you can just cast it for X equals 5 or something, and then they usually just die immediately. So having a card that's good at almost every cost and good when, against a wide variety of decks, I think is really valuable. Plus, 4th Aerlingus is pretty easy to splash.
Bowmasters is kind of interesting. 4th and Bombardiers both excel at getting the game over with. Bowmasters is just so strong because it plays so well at so many different styles of games. Your opponent has cheap creatures. Great, Bowmaster. You have a draw 7. You want to have a Bowmasters. Your opponent has a draw 7. You want to have a Bowmasters. And so you get this, it's like a pretty big Venn diagram that you're spelling out where Orcish Bowmasters can be really good for you. It's got a lower floor than some of the other cards here, but it's so consistently doing something useful for you in your games.
I mean, we talked through it, and Hull Breacher is not in our top 50. I don't even know if it would be in our top 75 at this point. It'd be close. It's in the top 100. We pulled out 110 cards to start with, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ones that didn't make the cut. Hull Breacher is one of those, and I think the biggest difference is Hull Breacher is pretty close to a 0 if you don't combo with it. Sometimes it shuts off their stuff, and that is also great, but that's just not that good of a card. Bowmaster's base level card is really strong. It's great against blue decks, it's great against white decks, it's great against green decks, it's great against red decks, it's just a good card. So if I first pick a Bowmasters, I'm looking to pick up either cards like Skull Clamp or cards like Draw 7s, and both of those work really nicely.
And the floor is that if you don't end up in either of those places, you still have quite a good card for your deck. So
definitely. Swords to Plowshares is the best removal spell in the entire cube. It's just a fantastic card. It's also easily splashable, works well with Snapcaster Mage. It exiles. You can plow your own stuff to gain life. This is, I think, this is probably the highest card on the list, and the only card for quite some time besides, I guess, Thoughtseize, that's just a straight up 1-for-1 interaction spell. It just happens to cost 1 mana, be instant speed. I really like starting with Swords to Plowshares.
Yep. It's the fact that white has gotten so good has also really helped Swords to Plowshares' case, whereas in the past you might have had an interactive deck but that wouldn't want to have splashed white, but now you splash white and you're getting to play with swords. Maybe you're playing with a Lauren in your deck, a couple of other good interactive white cards, and it's a nice little package for you.
Minsc and Boo is also a really good assertive threat. So Minsc and Boo is one of the 3 green cards in the top 50, none of which are mono green. It just green just takes a beating under this particular metric. And I like Minsc and Boo, one of the best cards to accelerate out. It fits really nicely in red green, which I think is a good deck, and is just easily splashable in any deck that's one of the 2 colors. So I do value open-ended cards. Flash is not an example of that. Flash is a pretty narrow card, like you do want these specific cards. But most of the cards that I like taking early tend to be cards like Swords to Plowshares or Minsc and Boo, where you can kind of go in a bunch of different directions. That's a nice kind of feature of them. But yeah, Minsc and Boo, just a really good aggressive threat. It's still kind of high up there. I think as the best threat in its kind of like casting cost class of 4 or so mana. Caracas. It's funny, we had this a little lower than Mac yelled at us. He's like, you're just going to take Caracas higher than that. And I do think it actually should be taken extremely highly. Caracas is just basically no opportunity cost and has a huge effect on the game. It can mess with their stuff. It can protect your stuff. Venter's in this current cube. There's like Urza. Like there's a couple legends with ETBs. But even just having Caracas and you play against like a red-green mid-range deck and they're like on Lalia and Inti and Questing Beast, they're just like, well, what can I do?
Bristly Bill.
It actually shuts down Minsc and Boo really nicely.
Yes.
I mean, Caracas is hard to overrate, and now that we have it here, 17th, 18th on our list, I think 17th is I mean, that's about where we estimate we would take it.
Yeah, I mean, the point that you made about there being no opportunity cost or low opportunity cost, I think is true. Like, it's a little hyperbolic because playing an off-color land in your deck is going to be frustrating sometimes. But if you have a blue-black control deck, you absolutely should be splashing Caracas into it, even if you don't have a single white card into it. And you should be pretty happy about doing so because there's just nothing you're going to get for the mana you'd be using otherwise that's going to be nearly as efficient as what Caracas is when it's working.
I mean, if you don't have a mana base for it, just play it as a spell and play 18 or 19 land.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's better than whatever spell you would have played. Like, just think of Caracas, kind of like Strip Mine or Wasteland, as like a half spell, half land. But it's even better because it taps for white mana, which means in a white deck, it's just a plains with massive upside. There's
a lot of nice legends in white, too.
Definitely. So the One Ring is a kind of controversial card, too, because that's one that... talking to like Mac and them, like he would take it somewhere up there, and I respect that. The One Ring is a really nice card to start with, and it's colorless. I do think you need to generally be doing something proactive to make the best use of the One Ring, but that could be a combo, that could be aggression. Like this card fits perfectly fine into an aggro deck, and yeah, you do want acceleration. Cards like Mana Vault get a little better when you have the One Ring, Ancient Tomb, whatnot, but really, the fact that it's colorless and open-ended makes it a pretty good first pick.
Yeah, it gets better when you have something that you also like. If I eventually draw this and do this thing, like Fourth Aerlingus is probably the best example that you will be able to win the game with it. But so you do want to try to make sure you have cards like that with the One Ring if you can. And then also it's good to have access to some cards which can get your own the One Ring off of the table. So Tishana's Tidebinder is kind of a cheeky one that people sometimes don't notice is you can actually Tishana's Tidebinder your own the One Ring. Phyrexian Metamorph's another really, really great one because you get to copy it, you get the protection effect again, and you're getting to reset the number of burden counters you have back down to 0.
Yeah, so ways to Fairy Time Raveler is a nice way to bounce the One Ring, and you get to replay it. You have things like Thopter Foundry or Gut, like things that let you sacrifice artifacts, or another way. You want to, when you put the One Ring in your deck, you want to think, what is my deck capable of doing when I have a One Ring on 3 or 4 and I'm going to die to it? Like, what is my plan there? Some decks don't have a single way to remove their own One Ring, and that is okay. It is best if you have a way to do it. If you don't have a way to remove it, you better be pretty confident that your deck can close out the game or gain life, like a Reanimator deck with Archon of Cruelty or Vaultborn Tyrant. Perfectly good way to offset the One Ring.
Yep. So now we're going to get to Thoughtseize. This is, again, just pure interaction, but it's as pure as it gets. You get to see your opponent's hand and take any non-land card from it. And the fact is you also get a little bit of upside with your Reanimator. You can use it on yourself to discard. But honestly, most of why Thoughtseize is as high is just because it's hard to get cards that can interact so cheaply in the cube. And so efficiently with a variety of things. Counter spells used to sort of be the hallmark way of doing that in cube, but as things have gotten so cheap, so good, The more good cheap cards you have, the harder it is for counter spells to interact with the one you want to deal with. But Thoughtseize does the job most of the time.
Yeah, Thoughtseize being able to basically interact with every card class except lands just makes it that cheap, efficient, wide-ranging. Like Swords to Plowshares, there's not a whole lot of room for just one-for-one interaction on this list, and Thoughtseize is one of the few cards which I think does make the cut. All right. Our boy Lurrus. Lurrus is one that there's a very sizable contingent of people who think Lurrus is bad and don't understand why I keep taking it, which again, there's a lot of different commentators. I'm not trying to ascribe this to any one person, but Lurrus, I do think, is very, very good. You have to draft around it. It's not open-ended in that sense. In fact, it cuts off more cards than most do, right? Like you all of a sudden, there's just cards you can't put in your deck. But the upside of having a companion that you can pick up and a really powerful one at that, lifelink even, replay stuff from your graveyard. If I see an early Lurrus, I think it is worth taking.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult also to draft with Lurrus. Like, you have to, when you're going to draft Lurrus, you know you're going to be in for playing longer games. And so you have to be able to balance all of these things. Like, how much do I feel like my deck really needs more fixing? How much does it need more removal or interaction for combo versus cards that I can recur with Lurrus versus ways to actually help me start apply threats that can really apply pressure to my opponent, ways to recur Lurrus. So there's a lot of things going on when you're drafting a Lurrus deck, and I can easily understand if somebody's drafted it and they haven't had maybe as good of results or they haven't found it to be a strong experience. But the thing that I've seen more frequently is that when you draft Lurrus, you just have this incredible inevitability engine, especially when you have a couple ways to recur Lurrus and protect it. That means that you can focus your energies on just not losing, and then you eventually just take over the game.
Yeah, I still think Lurrus is a worthy early pick, and it honestly doesn't compete as much as you would think, just because of how powerful the cheap cards are in the cube, and you normally want those anyway. But I do think it's gotten weaker over time. I think Lurrus is weaker in this iteration of the cube than it has been in the last couple, for example, especially if you go back 6 months or a year, just because there's new good permanents at 3 or more that do make it so Lurrus is more of a cost. Speaking of one of those, Fable the Mirror Breaker, really good card. You don't need to do really anything in specific when you draft a Fable. It's just good. It's better if you have creatures that are good to copy, for sure, but a blue-red creatureless deck will play Fable just as much as a red-white creature deck. So I like that. Fable's just a really powerful 3-mana card that puts you into red, base red, but that's about it. So it's a solid card. I'm not unhappy when I first picked Fable. Mana Vault, really good acceleration, so much weaker. It's more like a Dark Ritual than any other of these, because you use it once and usually actually becomes a drawback after that. It's really sick if you can sacrifice it to Gut or Thopter Foundry, but overall, or Okoing your own Mana Vault can be really nice. But it's still a big burst of mana. You still get to cast a 5-drop on turn 2, and for that reason, I think Mana Vault's still a pretty good high pick. You do really need to draft around it, more so than most of the busted accelerants, because it specifically does want you to play 5-mana cards, 4-mana cards, not so much 3 and 2-mana cards. So Tolarian Academy is an interesting one. I'm a little lower on Academy and artifacts in general. I feel like they took away some of the support for that in this cube, and I think it's gotten drafted a little bit more. Like, Manifold Key doesn't wheel, I've found, not every time. And I think that one of the biggest risks to taking Tolarian Academy, and again, we're talking optimizing your chance to win, right? Not just you like to play Academy, because I'll take it sometimes because of that.
Yeah.
I just think if you first pick a Tolarian Academy and someone else at your table first picks an Urza a couple seats down, you both might just not have a good time, because it's not like people are passing you, any of these kinds of Moxes and Soul Rings and whatnot. So you're both going to be fighting over the support cards. It's kind of the same reason that if you're the second Reanimate deck at the table, you do suffer. And I feel like Artifacts falls into that category. That said, Academy is frequently the best card in the decks where you draft it. It's such a good card. And if you have a good Academy deck, it's pretty hard to beat. Academy is a fantastic card.
Yeah, with a lot of the cards we're going to be looking at, a thing we're going to be, if they're ranked lower than this, they might have a higher ceiling. And a ceiling that comes up more often than some of the other cards, but it probably also means that they have a lower floor, that they just don't make your deck, or they're just only okay in your deck. Whereas, when we get to, looking down, like a card, both Demonic Tutor and Parallax Wave are cards that are probably not as good in a lot of cases as Tolarian Academy. but they are way more consistent.
Yeah, when you look at how, the floor ceiling argument, like Flash is another card I go back to that has a pretty low floor. You might not play it. I've put Flash in my sideboard after first picking it before, but it doesn't take much to make a good Flash deck. If you have like a Mystical Tutor, a Flash, a Vaultborn Tyrant, and a Worldspine Worm, that's enough of a package to have a good Flash deck. Academy, you need like your whole deck to be built around this card, and sometimes you're not wheeling Pentad Prism or Ether Spellbomb. You're not getting the 7th pick Mox Opals, and that's my main risk to taking that. Demonic Tutor is another interesting one because this is kind of a force multiplier where the better your deck is, the better Demonic Tutor is. If you have any of the cards in the first column, like let's say you, especially like Walk, Lotus, Ancestral, like the ones that you really want to build your deck around, you don't really build your deck around Moxes in the same way. If you first picked Time Walk, for example, and you saw a 4th pick Demonic Tutor, you'd be almost always just take it. Like, if you first picked Animate Dead, Demonic Tutor is a great follow-up. It's just really good at making your deck do whatever it is it already is trying to do. So it's a pretty low-cost way to make your deck more consistent, and it's just a really powerful card.
Yeah, the more you're willing to be drafting weirdo combo decks, the more you should be taking Demonic Tutor high. If you're not taking, like, a 7th pick Worldspine Worm in pack 1, because over some medium playable, because you want to spec on maybe Flash will get open in packs 2 or 3, Demonic Tutor's not going to have as much value for you because you're not going to have outs to end up with these busted draws with it.
It's not great in a fair deck. Like, a fair deck is just not going to utilize Demonic Tutor all that well. Parallax Wave is great in a fair deck, and it's it's funny. It and Swords to Plowshares and Solitude are all like kind of reactive-ish cards, but ways they just kind of break the symmetry in some ways. Like Parallax Wave kills all their creatures and protects all yours kind of at the same time, gets tokens forever. Like, this is a card that I frequently am like, how can I lose? And then they cast Parallax Wave and then you lose.
It's the best Wrath in the cube.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty legit reason to go into white, and I think you should take Parallax Wave really highly. I wouldn't be surprised if it should be even a little bit higher. I don't know. It's a great card.
Yeah.
Reanimate and Animate Dead are both very close together, and I like them a lot more than taking something like Entomb, which you notice is not even in the top 50, though I think that one would probably make the next 10 or so. I just think that Reanimate and Animate Dead are good in any deck that can cast them. They get better when you have cards that combo with them. They get better the more removal you have to kill their creatures, but it's a pretty safe bet just taking one of those cards, and that's why I like starting with them.
Yeah, the Animate Dead Reanimate discussion has gotten closer. I'm still think I would probably take Reanimate or Reanimate Dead, but the presence of 6 and Malevolent Rumble now makes the fact that Animate Dead and Necromancy are have permanent types and they reanimate, make them more valuable than they were before MH3.
It used to be that Reanimate got the nod because, first of all, it was one cheaper, and second of all, there was more tutors to find it. Specifically, Mystical and Spellseeker could go get it, whereas they couldn't get Animate. And the probably the most important overall, it just doesn't die to enchantment removal. I think like having your reanimated creature die to a Beseju or a Loran is just kind of a bummer. But yeah, it's definitely gotten closer. 6, Malevolent Rumble, Lurrus are all reasons that Animate Dead kind of plays a little bit better. So, to follow up on Flash, Sneak is another big one that we tend to draft a lot. I just think that despite this being a combo card, if you take Sneak early, you can usually get there because the pool of cards that are good with Sneak is even wider than Flash because all of a sudden you have like Archon of Cruelty, Emrakul, just anything with an attack trigger becomes really good, and Sneak is one of the best ways to cheat them out. You do need mana accelerants or some way to interact because it does cost 4 and then really 5 total, but if you first pick a Sneak, I feel like you can build around it pretty effectively over the course of the draft.
Yeah, and one of the things you want to do with both Sneak Attack and Flash is you're frequently going to be trying to figure out how to get them into decks where you have additional ways to get the big fatties into play. It could be Reanimator, it could be Tinker. In the case of like a green-red Sneak Attack deck, it could be that you're just accelerating into your Atalis or your Vaultborn Tyrants. And then Sneak Attack and Flash, what they do for any of those kinds of decks is they give you sort of like a cheat code that's much stronger than you would otherwise normally have in your draws.
Yeah, so I like an early Sneak. I do like an early Library. It's funny, I feel like I just feel like the metagame keeps shifting, and I like Library. I'm a little lower on it than I used to be, though. It's still, I mean, we still have it, 29th here? Like, that's pretty strong. My main issue with library kind of goes back to the ancestral mocks thing we talked about, which is I just don't find games coming down to like trading cards one for one and someone running out of cards as much as someone getting outpaced on the board. That said, if you can draft a Swords to Plowshares, a Lightning Bolt, a Force of Will, and then like a library, like that's a really excellent sort of thing. Not necessarily all those colors at once, but 0 and 1 mana interaction plus library can really just mess someone up. And there's matchups where when you go turn on library and they play like a turn on Rafine's Tower, you know you're in for a good time. But imagine you have library in your hand on the draw and they just play, a turn on Usher of the Fallen or, a Ragavan or even like a Birds of Paradise. You're not feeling great about that. So I still take it really highly, but I would take it under something like Swords, Bowmaster, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're not limited by what colors you can use with library. You're limited by did you get the cheap good cards in those colors. And you could have a good deck otherwise, but it might not be the kind of black deck that has good library cards if you don't have Inquisition and Thoughtseize and Snuff Out. Yeah, great example.
Yeah, so library's good, but make sure you're doing your deck is fast enough interacting or being putting itself on the board. Like library in a green deck can also work where you lead on library and then go land elf right afterwards. You just need something to catch up after that.
Worth also mentioning that Library of Alexandria is one of the better discard outlets in the cube.
When you're on the draw and you can go turn on library, main phase draw, discard a Troxon turn one, it's just filthy. Solitude, another really strong card, another cheap or free spell. Basically, Solitude is a sick 2-for-1 if you cast it, a 1-for-2 if you have to pitch it, but at 0 mana still just gets you out of like, they sneak attacked an Emrakul out on turn 3, or they went for some play that like a Psychic Frog play when you were tapped out and you just had the Solitude. Right. There is Ephemerate and Touch the Spirit Realm. I don't really go for those combos that often anymore, but it is nice if you reanimate it. Flickering it with Parallax Wave or Restoration Angel or what have you can be really strong. Solitude just has a lot of combos, is a good card to cast, is a good card to pitch. That makes it, I think, a really high pick. Ragavan is another MH3 card, or MH2 card. MH2 card, sorry. Where it's probably the most fearsome turn 1 play that isn't like, involving a Mox or whatever. Like when they go Mountain Ragavan, you just feel like if you can't answer it, you're going to lose the game because you basically will. It's one of the best early red threats. I have it quite a bit below Bombardiers. I think you do too, just because this Bombardiers is always good, but Ragavan is really fearsome early.
Yeah, just the fact that being on the draw or when your opponent just is playing a cheap creature deck with like, you have Thraben Inspector, and then it's like, oh my gosh, how's this Ragavan ever going to do anything? Does bring it a little bit lower, but it's obviously just an incredible early play when it gets rolling.
This is a tricky one. Force of Will. So Force of Will, the best counter, because it costs 0. Where do you put it? We're both a little bit more down on blue than we used to, but still Force is going to be one of the best blue cards in your deck, and a card I'm happy to take early.
Yeah, Force of Will is more likely we're looking at this Pack 1 perspective to get me into blue than basically any of the other blue cards, because I know I'm going to have this angle of I can dig for and find my Force of Will, and then I'm going to be able to have the ability to tap out against decks. And, in 2024 Magic, it's not just when you're up against, black and they can have reanimation spells. Every color, as you can see here, well, green has some big plays too, natural order, but every color has plays that are going to be like, oh my gosh, if I didn't answer that, if I didn't leave my mana untapped, I would just lose to it, and Force of Will gets you out of those situations.
I mean, once again, just beating the drum of being proactive. Force of Will is not at its best when you're trying to like answer all their threats, because it's even a 2-for-1. What it's the best at is if you tap out for a threat. A Fable the Mirror Breaker, One Ring is amazing with Force of Will. Really anything like that, even Psychic Frog or Oko, whatever, Palace Jailer, or just cast something that makes forward progress and force their next play, and that's usually enough to put yourself in a pretty good position. I mean, a lot of these cards, if you back them up with Force of Will, you getting to play your 3 or 4 mana play and then counter their 3 or 4 mana play is enough to win the game. So Force of Will is at its best when doing that, and I think it's worth speccing on early. Just like Psychic Frog, this is one of the best new threats in the cube. Again, it's kind of like Ragavan. When your opponent plays one of these on turn 2, it's like, some decks are just like, well, I guess that's that. You get to draw a card every single turn, and you just have like effectively a 5/6 in play for 2 mana. Cool. It's a beating of a card.
Really combines well with draw 7s, and then when you go up against like anything in the teamer colors, you get to really kind of push your advantage because, red has some amount of damage removal, but green and blue has like basically no way to interact with creatures once they're on the board. Like a brazen bar, but it just means that you get to like immediately take over the board in such a strong way against some colors like Gruul, which are frequently trying to win at that axis of the game. And so there's a lot to like about the card just proactively and also to defend you.
When you first pick a Psychic Frog, what are you trying to draft towards?
Just mostly I'll just take whatever is good in terms of blue and black. I mean, I'm happy to be a domain deck, happy to be Reanimator, happy to just be blue-black.
Draw sevens,
Draw sevens, yeah. I don't think you need to push it in any particular direction, but it definitely gets you started down the route of being interested in being a draw 7 deck.
Fury is another one that's good with draw sevens. This takes a bit of a ding compared to, say, Solitude because it's harder to be heavy red than heavy white, I think, in this cube. It's still a good card.
And the sorcery speed matters a lot. You play against Bombardiers or Gut, and it's like, waiting a turn here is going to be pretty devastating.
Fury's pretty good at cleaning up Gut, but
yes.
But yes, I agree with you that it being a sorcery is definitely a thing. That said, still a good early pick, and these are kind of like ordered within the tier. But honestly, any card with plus or minus 5 slots from each other, even in a separate tier, it's not going to be that different. So keep that in mind. Obviously, that the biggest cliff is between Ancestral Recall and Flash. But like, if someone were to tell me that like they like to first pick Mana Leak over Solitude, I wouldn't think that was crazy. I don't think you should do it, but I don't think that's completely wild. Same with like Mana Vault versus any card near it, whatever. Fury, good card if you like drafting that kind of deck. I would tend to be like red green. I think is one of the decks that can use Fury well, or decks with draw sevens. Urza is another card that can go wrong. Like, the floor is still pretty high. I've played Urza in, like, a blue-white deck that has no other artifacts, and it's still okay. But obviously, when you first pick an Urza, you're hoping to draft a deck where Tellurian Academy would be good. It doesn't always get there, but it's a reasonable spec. Have you liked Urza in any other deck other than, like, heavy artifacts? Like, when you first pick it, that's what you are hoping to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be what maximizes it. I really appreciate what Urza can do in terms of allowing me in the mid-game to being able to spend a lot of mana on cards and still have up a counterspell. And it sort of forces the issue a little bit because it's like it's not going to get better for your opponent once Urza's in play, so they start playing into you a little bit more. These are all really nice things for a blue deck to have access to. There's some amount of menace in the cube, so just having multiple bodies is nice. It just does a lot of things, and then the ceiling gets really high. And I would say it's very easy for artifacts to be open, but for you to not have many good payoffs for having a lot of artifacts. Urza, Tellurian Academy, Kappa Cannoneer, those are like the biggest ones that really pay off for just having a high density of artifacts.
Yeah, Tinker, another one like that. Atraxa is the best value in the cube. The reason Atraxa gets the nod here over Vaultborn Tyrant, Archon of Cruelty, which you can actually find here, Emrakul, which didn't quite make the list, is it works with everything, actual everything. It doesn't leave a body in play for Flash, but flashing in Atraxa is still pretty good. Like, especially in a deck that can then reanimate it, for example. Obviously, it's great to sneak into play. It's surprisingly castable. It's good to reanimate into play with any of those or through the breach into play. You can natural order for it. You can Green Sun Zenith for it. It just kind of does it all. So as far as a narrow first pick, I don't mind starting with Atraxa.
Yeah. And like, having actual good stats and keywords that is like difficult to ignore. The vigilance is pretty big. Like, I don't know what to tell you. It does a lot.
Oko fallen a little bit. The Oko used to be in like maybe the second tier or the third tier. I still think Oko's quite good, but yeah, you can see you can see the age, the cracks of age when Oko's battling against like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Broadside Bombardiers, and it's like, oh yeah, 3 drops are just really good these days. So Oko's great. No, nothing wrong with taking it early, but I don't think I would take it over the cards in the previous tiers.
Yeah, it's become a little bit harder too for you to just like have a blue-green deck that is board control-y.
Yeah.
But that's all right.
Mana Leak, the best of the 2-mana counters. In fact, Mana Drain not even on the list because in a pick one, pack one situation, I just don't think you want to take a double blue card if you can help it. And counterspells as a whole have gotten worse. So yeah, Mana Leak is still good, and I think it's very close to Jailer and Fetch and Oko and all that. But I, I'm not. We're getting to the point where I'm not really happy to be first picking these cards. I think like I understand that you're not going to open a top 50 card every single time you open a pack, obviously. But if your goal is to win one of these cube events, like you're hoping to do a little better than a pick one pack one Mana Leak.
I'm happy with whatever I get.
Why? That's not that's not a real growth mindset there. Palace Jailer, great white card. It's a little expensive. It's a sorcery. It's 4 mana. Still a very, very good card. And pretty much if you draft this, you should just try to draft mono white or red white. That's the best place for it.
Palace Jailer games, like, because there's so many good haste cards and ways to like get back the monarchy. Palace Jailer, I think, is now at its best in more aggressive decks, whereas I think it used to be a little bit more helpful for control. But you want to be able to like win the seesaw, where you Palace Jailer, unlock a big attack, your opponent attacks, takes back the monarchy, but now their shields are down again. There's only maybe one blocker back. It's whatever they got, and now you get to go all in again. And once you get that seesaw going, if you have the right early plays leading up to it, you're just going to take over the game because you've established a good curve and you have a lot of stats on the board.
Here we go. Here's a fetch land. Number 40. Flooded Strand represents all the fetch lands. I think the fetch lands are all very close. It doesn't really matter like which ones you take or not. But
yeah,
I guess a fetch land is a fine first pick. Like that's about the level.
You should take the fetch lands in the order of whatever it is you draft the most. Like if you're just a sicko who just drafts Simic all the time, you should probably take Misty Rainforest higher than Arid Mesa. But if you're one of those Boros gamers, and we know lots of those, yeah, Arid Mesa is the best.
Arid Mesa actually is probably one of the better ones because that deck needs its fixing more. But in any case, fetch land, fine place to start. None of the other lands make the cut here in the top 50. And honestly, I don't think the duels or triumphs are really in even the top 75 most likely. It just feels like they're pretty replaceable. There's Raugrin Triumph, and then there's Meticulous Archive or Thundering Falls, and it's not to say that you would even necessarily want which one you'd want depending on which colors of decks you're in. But if you're a Jeskai deck and you get a Thundering Falls instead of a Raugrin Triumph, it's still probably fine.
Yeah, pick orders obviously vacillate wildly once you start knowing what you're working with.
Definitely.
And in the case of the duels and things like that, it's until you kind of know that you're going to want that specific duel, it's hard to justify taking it.
The White Ragavan, Ocelot Pride is next, and honestly, if someone were to take it, pick one over Force of Will or Psychic Frog or Fury, I wouldn't say that's crazy. I think this card is nuts. When you cast it on turn 1, it feels like Ragavan, where, if your opponent doesn't answer it, you just win the game. But later in the game, it has all these synergies, like you play a Thraben Inspector, you cast a Lingering Souls, or whatever it is. I've seen some pretty filthy things with Ocelot Pride. If you're able to gain a life in the mid game and then just make multiple tokens, 3 or 4 tokens in the same turn, it's got a really high ceiling and a really high floor, and it only costs 1 mana. That's a kind of card that you want as many as you can get of.
Yeah, I do agree that it is the current winner for best white 1-drop in the cube, edging out Mother of Runes.
Felia's next, Cats and Dogs. Felia, honestly, this or Containment Priest are both very good, very pretty high picks. I'm a little less confident about exactly the placement there, but still, just white has a lot of really good assertive plays, and Felia has been excellent. Archon of Cruelty is here on power level, obviously. This one is a little more narrow than something like Atraxa. Honestly, I think Vaultborn, Tyrant, and Archon are pretty close, so I could have seen slotting in Vaultborn there because it works with a bunch of stuff too. But Archon is probably the best thing to Shallow Grave into play. Maybe Emrakul's better, but they're comparable, and it does some really good work. So I would say Archon stands in for a lot of the different fatties here too, like Emrakul or Vaultborn, depending on where you're at. You're hopefully not first picking them. You hopefully have a little information about it before you kind of commit there. Remand and Memory Lapse, 2 more good counters. Again, they cost single blue. They're about the same. I don't know. It kind of depends on what your deck's doing. The more of a combo deck you are, the better Remand tends to be because you just want to see more cards. Control decks, Memory Lapsing and knowing you're getting a whole turn off is pretty nice, but they're both really good.
Yeah, they both have their moments.
Strip Mine is another one that has gone down a bit. It's a colorless, powerful first pick. You're not really going to be unhappy if you take Strip Mine. I don't put a ton of value on going for like the strip mine Ramanop type stuff, I found that doesn't decide the game that often. Like if you're able to kill their first two things, then do that, sure. But the killing their first two things part is a big part of that. So I like strip mine. My favorite combos with it are Titania and Ren and 6, I think. More so than Crucible or Ramanop, because the Titania and Ren and 6 are, I think, just better cards.
Yeah, Titania is really sweet because there's other nice combos with it, like with Zurin Orb and Sylvan Safekeeper. So that's a great little package you can start heading towards when you get Strip Mine.
Lightning Bolt, pretty hard to beat the classic. It's just super efficient, super cheap. I mean, I'm never really unhappy to have this card in my deck.
If you're watching this video and you want us to explain why Lightning Bolt's a good Magic card, there's like 30-something years of content for you to discover.
I mean, it's kind of like a Swords to Plowshares, much worse, but it hits Planeswalkers, it hits your opponent, it's in a color that can really make use of those things, so pretty happy to take Bolt, and Bolt is quite a bit better than all the other bolts in the cube. Chain Lightning, Burst Lightning, Unholy Heat, that sort of thing, but they make good proxies for that, so that is an argument for maybe not taking Bolt quite this high. But again, kind of like Archon stands in for some of the fatties, Bolt stands in for like some of the like decent removal, even like Fatal Push, that sort of thing. Skullclamp, a card I used to think was overrated. I'm pretty high on it now. I do think that you need a lot of cards to make it work, because you not only need a bunch of creatures, that's the first part, but you also need a way to make it so you're not just losing ground by spending mana to draw cards. So that means things like Gaia's Cradle or fast mana like Moxen to get the mana back and start making plays, or just a bunch of good cheap interaction like Solitude or Lightning Bolt or Swords to Plowshares, where you're like clamp, draw 4, Solitude your thing, Bolt your thing. That's like a kind of like what Library asks, except you also need the cheap creatures. So I love Skullclamp. In some decks, it's amazing. It's not my favorite card to first pick for just because of how narrow it can be. Gut is another really good aggressive threat. I think it's a little worse than Fable or Broadside Bombardiers. It is very good, and if you have enough 1s and 2s and fodder, it can be really, really strong. This is probably like the most snowball-y card I can think of. That or like Minsk and Boo, where your opponent plays this and you're like, now I'm behind by multiple things and just took a bunch of damage? Yeah, I don't have a chance of winning this game.
Right.
Pyrogoyf, fantastic card. I can see this one moving up in the rankings. It's just frequently 4 mana for like a 4/5 or a 5/6 that eats one of their things, or just kills them.
Yeah, and the best thing you can do with Pyrogoyf is have some ways in your deck to be able to get multiple Pyrogoyfs and play at the same time.
Oh yeah, Phantasmal Image is 2 triggers the second time. Barrogoyf triggers the Pyrogoyf.
Satya does a real nice job with it.
Yeah, definitely.
Phyrexian Metamorph, because you just get an absurd number of deal damage triggers from it.
All right, so that's our top 50. Let's talk about some of the cards that didn't make the cut, but if I had to choose the cards I think most likely to move, I think like some of the newer cards like Pyrogoyf or Ocelot Pride, as we get more experience with them. I definitely think that Flash is probably one of our more controversial picks in terms of we have it here where other people would have it in one of these two columns, or maybe not even in the top 50. I'm not sure. We like Lurrus a lot, but I think Lurrus is good. If you're asking, like, do I actually pick with this order? Like, wouldn't I take Academy over Caracas, for example? It depends on the context. Yeah, if I'm playing in a league draft and I want to draft an Academy deck, I would probably do that. But if I was playing in a 64-player draft, try to get into Cube Worlds, I think that you should... This is our best effort to make a list based on what we would pick in that situation. I mean, I think that wouldn't necessarily always be the case, but this is pretty close to kind of how we'd go about things.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Okay, so taking a look at some other cards. So these are some of the cards that didn't quite make the cut. So we're talking cards like Entomb, Shieldred, Ancient Tomb, and Tinker. So I think for Tinker, I think it's just a little bit more narrow than I would like. Same with Entomb. It just, both of these cards, you can miss first picking them at a slightly higher rate than I would like. They're both really good. They both could be the best card in your deck or one of the best cards in your deck, and you can have busted decks featuring them. But I guess I'd put kind of Emrakul in that list too. Lion's Eye Diamond. These are all cards with high ceilings but pretty low floors. And I just prefer not to first pick those cards.
Yeah, that all checks out with me. I mean, as far as like my favorite card that we didn't have on the list, I would probably say it's Emrakul, just because I like to draft ways to get Emrakul into play. But Even I can admit that it's probably not consistent enough to make the top 50. Fire Covenant, it's also a pretty tough cut. It's also one I could easily imagine is actually a top 50 card. You end up getting it later, and it's pretty easy to splash. So, I mean, it's a difficult thing to quantify with with something like this top 50 pack one pick one, is like, how do you adjust to actual reality? Because out of all the cards that we're looking at, Fire Covenant wheels more than it should compared to a lot of these cards. And
like,
so
you get fifth pick Caracases, like, I've gotten late flashes. Like, yes, this is for what we think the order should be, not necessarily how people in the wild are picking. Because, like, the best example of that is Once Upon a Time.
Yeah.
We don't have to pick Once Upon a Time fourth pick because it just wheels every single time.
Yeah, I mean...
But we would pick it fourth pick if we couldn't get it otherwise.
There's a big difference when the card has a realistic wheel possibility, though. Like, the fact is like, I'm going to take Caracas really high, even though I get it fourth or fifth, because I'm not going to get it ninth. Fire Covenant, you actually do still wheel a decent amount of the time. So if it wheeled as much as I think it should, maybe I would have it in my top 50. But as it stands, I can't actually tell somebody they should be taking it that high, because you do have some equity from it coming back.
Necromancy is just a great card, but just, I think, kind of pushed out here. Shieldred's a card I'm a little bit lower on. It's still very good, but 4 mana is such a competitive slot, and it's double black, and it's kind of like Hull Breacher, which I guess is probably in this category too of... It's really good with a draw 7, but I don't draft draw 7 decks that much, and I don't think you should draft draw 7 decks quite that often. So...
And then shout out to Basalt Monolith, getting that out of a Grim Monolith. But, right now the Moto Cube has a number of ways to to get infinite mana with this card. The
Zerta and Gadgeteer,
the Gadgeteer, yeah. And then, so I think the fact that those cards exist pushes it above Grim Monolith. So.
And then Ancient Tomb, Chrome Mox, and Lotus Petal are all really good ways to accelerate. Mox Diamond is another one. And just not quite as powerful as the cards on the list, I think. Containment Priest, I think, could be on the list, kind of where Felly is about. Like, it's in that same slot. And then Mana Drain. Mana Drain, I mentioned it before, but just starting with a double blue reactive card, not really where I'd want to be. That said, if some boomer wants to first pick a Mana Drain, I'm not going to argue with them. So,
yeah, I mean, Mana Drain's getting hit in multiple directions, right? Because it's both, do you have, how much do you want double blue in the vacuum? How expensive are the things you're going to be forced to counter with Mana Drain? Well, they've been getting cheaper.
Yeah.
And then what are the cards in your deck that you care about casting look like? Well, the fewer generic mana costs that they have in their casting costs, the less Mana Drain is going to be impactful for them. So it's getting squeezed in a lot of directions. Still a real good card, but you can start to understand why it's not doing as much as it used to.
Like, and you're supposed to put cheaper cards in your deck now, and you basically do. So Drain also gets worse because of that. So that is our top 50 here. And that's the last order there. Boom. It even kept the order. Funny. Let us know what our big misses were, if any. Let us know kind of what you think. And if you like this format, it's fun to discuss these. Every couple months, I feel like it's good to do a little refresh on the top 50 list. But I'm sure there's other similar things we could kind of drill into besides just top 50 pick one, pack ones. And, if you think we're really wrong about Time Walk, Luris, Flash, I'm curious what other people think. But this is where we're at. And as always, BK, thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. And let's get back to the Cube treats. We'll be back tomorrow with another Cube Draft. See you there. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. It helps out the channel, and you won't miss a single draft.